The crystal chandelier sparkled above the ballroom, reflecting 1,000 lights across the crowd of elites dressed in pride and diamonds. Laughter floated through the air, soft music played in the background, and every glance carried silent competition. Among them stood Ethan Cole, the newly appointed CEO whose quiet confidence made the room pause. He wasn't just another businessman. He was the man everyone had underestimated until tonight. Across the room, Veronica Hayes, wife of the billionaire host, noticed him. Her smile was sharp, her tone polished, the kind that could charm or cut, depending on her mood. She didn't like surprises, and Ethan's name had been on everyone's lips since the merger her husband was losing control over. With a glass of red wine in her hand and too much pride to swallow, she walked straight toward him. The conversation started, polite, a few smiles, a few carefully chosen words. But as whispers spread and cameras caught the tension, Veronica's temper snapped. Before anyone could react, the wine spilled deep red across Ethan's tailored suit. The room fell silent. Ethan didn't move. He didn't shout. He just looked at her, calm, unreadable, and dangerously quiet. Within seconds, the balance of power in that glittering hall shifted, because what Veronica didn't know was that the man she tried to humiliate wasn't just a guest. He was the one person who held the future of her empire in his hands. A murmur spread through the hall as waiters froze mid-step, unsure whether to intervene. Veronica's painted smile trembled for the first time that evening. Her husband, Richard Hayes, stood across the room, his jaw tightening as he watched the scene unfold. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew Ethan Cole wasn't a man to be disrespected. In just 2 years, he had turned a failing tech firm into one of the fastest-growing empires in the country. Investors trusted him. The media adored him. And now, it seemed, the Hayes family had just made him an enemy. Ethan calmly dabbed his sleeve with a napkin, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "Accidents happen," he said softly, though his eyes held a weight that made Veronica's confidence waver. The calmness wasn't forgiveness, it was warning, and everyone could feel it. Hours later, as the guests tried to pretend nothing had happened, Richard approached Ethan privately. His tone was forced, almost desperate, hinting that he knew the damage was already done. "Let's not make tonight bigger than it needs to be," he murmured. But Ethan only offered a polite smile and walked away. That night, Veronica couldn't sleep. The image of Ethan's calm face haunted her, not angry, just knowing. By morning, the first rumors began to circulate online. Stock prices trembled, calls went unanswered. Something was shifting behind the scenes, and Veronica was starting to realize the truth. One spilled glass of wine might have cost her everything. By the next afternoon, the media had picked up fragments of the story, the Hayes Gala incident, they called it. No one had video proof, but witnesses whispered enough to make it believable. Some said Veronica had done it out of jealousy. Others claimed she'd been defending her husband's honor. Either way, the damage was done. Sponsors began pulling back. Investors asked questions, and the company's board started demanding answers. Ethan, meanwhile, remained silent. He made no public statement, no press release, just a single meeting behind closed doors with a team of lawyers and analysts. To those who knew him, that silence was the storm before the thunder. He wasn't seeking revenge in words. He was moving with precision, the kind that made powerful people nervous. Inside the Hayes mansion, tension thickened. Richard tried to reassure Veronica, insisting it would blow over, but his voice lacked conviction. Their empire was already under strain, a few risky deals, declining profits, and now this scandal. The perfect image they'd built for years was cracking, and Ethan's shadow seemed to grow longer with every headline. Meanwhile, a journalist named Maya had started digging deeper. She'd covered Ethan's rise before, and sensed there was more to the story: old ties, quiet betrayals, and a merger that wasn't as clean as it looked. Her curiosity turned the story into something bigger, something personal. And while the city buzzed with rumors, Ethan was already preparing his next move, one that would change everything they thought they controlled. 3 days later, the Hayes building was surrounded by reporters. The board had called an emergency meeting after leaked documents hinted at internal mismanagement. Screens flashed headlines about financial irregularities and a mysterious investor pulling out at the last minute. Veronica sat in her car, gripping her phone as messages poured in. Panic from employees, silence from her husband. She had no idea that every domino falling was part of a plan already set in motion. Inside the boardroom, Ethan stood calm, his tone measured as he presented data, numbers, and evidence that left no room for denial. The Hayes Corporation had been on the edge for months, hiding behind lavish parties and fake projections. Richard tried to defend himself, but his voice cracked under pressure. The same people who once praised him now avoided his gaze. It was clear someone had exposed everything. Veronica entered the room, just as Richard slammed a folder shut, his face pale. She met Ethan's eyes across the long table, and for a moment, the world went quiet. His expression was unreadable, not vengeful, but certain. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing the truth is finally in your favor. Meanwhile, Maya, the journalist, was piecing together the last bit of the puzzle. Her latest lead connected Ethan's company to a secret acquisition, one that could decide who controlled the future of the Hayes empire. And just as she hit publish, The phone on Veronica's desk rang. The voice on the other end said quietly, "It's over." Veronica froze, the voice echoing in her mind long after the call ended. It's over. But whose voice was it? It wasn't Ethan's, it was familiar.com. Precise. Someone she thought had disappeared years ago. Panic clawed at her chest as she dialed Richard, but he didn't answer. The line went straight to voicemail. Outside, camera flashes erupted. Reporters shouted her name. Inside, the company's stock continued to nosedive. At the same moment, Ethan received a notification on his phone. A confidential report he hadn't authorized was circulating online, one that exposed his company's hidden deal with a foreign investor. Someone had turned the spotlight around. His jaw tightened. He'd been careful, too careful, but this leak was deliberate. Someone on the inside wanted him cornered. The hunter was being hunted. Maya, the journalist, was already watching the chaos unfold. Her story had gone viral, but new information appeared in her inbox. Untraceable documents linking both Ethan and Richard to an offshore fund created years ago under a false name. She frowned, realizing this wasn't just a corporate feud anymore. It was a trap. Veronica finally made it to Richard's office, but the room was empty, papers scattered, his laptop missing. On the desk lay a single folder with Ethan's name on it, and a note in Richard's handwriting. Asterisk, he was never after the company. Asterisk, Veronica's hands trembled. If Ethan didn't want the empire, what was he really after? Veronica stared at the note, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The words didn't make sense until she noticed the folder's contents. Inside were old emails, contracts, and a photograph. Her breath caught. It was Richard and Ethan years ago, shaking hands in front of a modest startup logo. They had once been partners. Ethan hadn't come to destroy the Hayes empire, he'd come to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Before she could process it, the office doors burst open. Richard stood there, disheveled and pale. He was supposed to disappear, he muttered, avoiding her eyes. I took the company from him. He wasn't supposed to survive it. His voice broke as he confessed that he had betrayed Ethan long ago, used his ideas, erased his name, and built his fortune on someone else's foundation. The truth hit Veronica like cold air. The gala, the merger, the silent soul of it, had been Ethan's quiet revenge. But before Ethan could celebrate his victory, another twist surfaced. Maya's final report revealed that Ethan had used the same shadow investors Richard once did, people just as ruthless, just as hungry for control. The cycle hadn't broken. It had only changed hands. Españo sirens wailed outside. Veronica looked out the window of the crumbling empire she once called home. Ethan stood across the street, watching it all unfold, expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, two people bound by pride, ambition, and the price of power. Then he turned away, leaving her to face what was left of the empire's ashes. Weeks later, the headlines began to fade, but the scars remained. The Hayes empire was dismantled piece by piece, its assets sold off quietly to pay debts and settlements. Veronica left the city, far from the noise and flashing cameras. For the first time, she lived without luxury, just silence and space to think. She replayed everything in her mind, realizing how pride and power had blinded them all. What she once thought was strength had only been fear dressed in diamonds. Ethan, on the other hand, stood at the edge of his new headquarters, overlooking the skyline. He had reclaimed the company's name, but not the peace he thought it would bring. Victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a reminder of how much he'd lost on the way there. The revenge that had driven him for years now felt hollow. He had become everything he once despised: strategic, cold, untouchable. Maya's final article closed the story for the public, but opened questions about ambition, ethics, and forgiveness. She ended it with a line that caught everyone's attention. Asterisk, empires fall, not because of enemies, but because of the truths they refused to face. Asterisk, as the sun dipped behind the city, Ethan looked down at the street below where people moved on, unaware of the battles fought above them. Somewhere, he hoped Veronica had found her peace. For both of them, the empire was gone, but maybe, in its ashes, there was a chance to start again, this time without masks.